I'm Scott Malevsky, and this is Interviews with Me.
Oh, Maine, your rivers, your back roads claim me.
This week, Susan Collins.
The number one lesson that I learned from my parents was to do what you think is right, even if it's difficult, even if you're criticized.
Because everyone has a story.
Welcome home to Maine.
My next guest is well known not only in Maine, but in our Congress. She has been a legislative assistant to former Senator William Cohen on the cabinet of Maine Governor John McKernan and the New England Regional Director of the Small Business Administration, and also a brief stint in Massachusetts as Deputy State Treasurer there under Joe Malone. Moving back to Maine, she was a Republican candidate for governor in 1994, losing to Angus King in the general election that year. In 1996, she ran successfully for the Senate seat being vacated by her former boss, William Cohen, and has been in that seat ever since. She currently ranks 12th in Senate seniority, chairs and serves on multiple committees, has cast more than 6,800 consecutive votes, and has never missed a roll call. Please welcome Susan Collins.
I listened to the one you did with Chandler Woodcock, which was
isn't
fun.
He a hoot?
He's a riot. I've always liked him.
He was a lot of fun.
I bet.
Thank you, Senator, for joining us. I really appreciate the time. I know you're very busy.
I'm delighted to be with you. Let's
start with the basics. I kind of want to get to your background in childhood. And you grew up in Caribou.
I did.
Tell me about that. How was it growing up in Caribou?
I was born in Caribou, raised there, went to school there, graduated from Caribou High School. I'm one of 6 children, and Caribou was a wonderful place to grow up. It still is. Back when I was growing up there, we had Loring Air Force Base nearby, so the population was larger than it is today. In fact, my high school class was either the largest or the second largest to ever graduate from Caribou High School. 263.
In your graduating class?
Mm-hmm. Really? Much larger than you would have guessed, I bet.
It's much larger. Mine was like 70. So, yeah.
It was a wonderful place in that there was a very strong sense of community. For example, each year during the potato harvest, when potatoes were almost exclusively harvested by hand back then, the schools were in recess for 3 weeks in the fall, and virtually everybody picked potatoes. I picked potatoes for a couple of years, and then I babysat for a couple who picked potatoes, which was a lot easier, I will say. But it was an example of the community coming together to help the farmers get the crop in before the heavy frosts made it impossible. That tradition helped to cement this strong sense of community. The other strong tradition of Aroostook County and Caribou was basketball. Basketball was king when I was growing up. I was able to be in high school. I was a sophomore when Caribou won the state championship with Mike Thurston's famous half-court shot right at the buzzer. So I was at that game, and boy, was it exciting.
Oh, I bet it was. Tell me about your parents.
My parents were, first of all, wonderful parents, and they were also very active in the community and at the state level. Each of them at various times served as mayor of Caribou. My mother was chair of the school board when I was in high school. In fact, she signed my high school diploma and went on to be the first woman to chair the University of Maine System Board of Trustees. My father served in the state senate. My grandfather did, and my great-grandfather did as well. So there was a very strong commitment to giving back to your community, your state, and public service. Exactly.
So you come from a long line of politics in the blood.
I do. I say it was in my DNA. My parents taught me that you couldn't complain if you just stayed on the sidelines and didn't get involved. And that was a valuable lesson. We ate dinner together every night. We talked about what went on at school and the issues of the day. They worked very, very hard. My mother was the religious education coordinator at the Catholic Church, which was then called Holy Rosary in Caribou. She did that for 10 years. She raised 6 children. My father obviously helped to raise the 6 children and ran our family retail lumber business, which will be celebrating its 175th anniversary this year. It's very unusual for a family-owned business to make it to the 3rd generation, much less the 5th.
Right.
My 2 younger brothers run the business now.
Did your whole family, were they involved in the business growing up at one point or another?
Mainly my father ran the business, and his brothers probably had shares in the business, but I believe that he bought them out and consolidated it. One of his brothers was a physician who practiced in Caribou. One was an attorney in Rockland, and one was a professor who moved away to Michigan.
So you have a family of overachievers.
I'm proud of my family. They've all worked very hard.
What are the best lessons that you've learned from your parents?
The number one lesson that I learned from my parents was to do what you think is right, even if it's difficult, even if you're criticized, even if it's really tough. Second, I learned to work really hard from them. Picking potatoes as a 10-year-old teaches you how to work hard, too, I will tell you, because I was told you can't quit. You can't let the farmer down. If you commit to picking potatoes, you've got to stay for the entire season or until he's finished harvesting his crop. Those were very good lessons to learn.
What was your favorite family tradition growing up?
Without a doubt, my favorite family tradition, well, there are 2, actually. One was that every Christmas we always sang Christmas carols around the piano on Christmas Eve. I have a younger sister who's extremely talented musically and went on to get a master's in music. She could play by ear. We both took piano lessons, but she was far, far more talented than I. And she also had a great singing voice and still does. And my father sang beautifully, and we always used to sing Christmas carols.
That's great.
And we still do with the next generation playing the piano now. The second family tradition was as soon as school got out, the very next weekend, we packed up and moved to Madawaska Lake for the summer and lived in our camp.
That's great.
I have wonderful memories of learning to swim and drive a boat and water ski and walk in the woods, and it was just a wonderful time. It was a very small camp considering how many children in my family. There were 4 of us who shared a bedroom with bunk beds, but it was just a wonderful time.
One of my questions is, how would you describe a perfect day when you were young? And that sounds like exactly what you just described.
It is indeed. A perfect day was at Madawaska Lake. I had a very good friend down the road named Debbie Gregory. We would go out in the boat and water ski and swim. And on rainy days, we played cards. We played endless card games and board games. I wrote plays, and we always put on some kind of performance every summer with all the kids, and we had just idyllic summers. We really did when we were little.
What was the worst thing you did growing up?
Now, if I told you that,
You are welcome to keep that to yourself.
I would never live it down, right? I was a pretty good kid. I'm sure that there were times when I gave my parents some grief, as all teenage girls and boys do, but I was a pretty good kid.
How often do you get back up to Caribou?
Fairly frequently. My mother is 91, and still lives in her own home. I'm fortunate that my two brothers and their families live in Caribou. My father passed away last year, which was really hard, even though I knew it was coming. He was 92 rather. I get up there probably once a month. I still get a ton of invitations from the county. And the most recently, just a week ago, I was up there in Frenchville, where the Dr. Levesque Elementary School won one of the prestigious Blue Ribbon Awards. That was really neat that this tiny school in Aroostook County won a national award for excellence.
That's fantastic.
Isn't it? There are about 100,000 schools in the United States, if memory serves me correctly, and only 349 received the Blue Ribbon Award.
Really? Wow.
There were 3 in the state of Maine, and the Dr. Levesque School in tiny Frenchville, Maine was one. So I went as part of their ceremony, and that was great fun.
That's fantastic. I love the fact that you're still so connected up there.
I do,
Very
too.
nice. You're going to laugh. What do you do in your spare time?
Well, unfortunately, I have very little spare time, but I love to cook. I love to read, and I love to kayak. I'm fortunate to have a camp on Coldstream Pond that's near Lincoln.
Yep.
When I can, I steal away, even if it's just for part of a day, with my husband and our dog, and we go up there and throw a stick into the water that the dog, Pepper, loves fetching. We go out and kayak, and I just love that.
So here's a question that just came off the top of my head. You do a cross-country road trip. Who's the first person you take with you?
Well, probably would be my husband because I don't get to see him enough since he's in Bangor during the week while I'm in Washington.
Right. That's got to be hard.
That is.
How long have you been married?
I've been married 6.5 years now.
Nice. How long have you known him?
I've known him for a very long time because he worked for Bill Cohen,
Yep.
As did I. And we stayed in touch over the years, but it was really when I started running for office and he was giving me some advice that our friendship was reignited and bloomed into love.
Switching gears a little bit to more of your personal life, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book is Empire Falls by Richard Russo, who lives in Maine, and I love his books. I think they're absolute masterpieces. I'm also very fond of Daniel Silva's books. I know Danny, and he writes spy novels. And since I serve on the Intelligence Committee, it's always fun for me to wonder who his sources are because he clearly understands more than the average person.
So they are pretty accurate then.
Well, there are parts of them that are. Obviously, they're fiction.
What's your favorite food? You love to cook. So
I do love to cook. To me, an ideal summer dinner at our camp would be to have shrimp cocktail followed by Maine lobster, followed with a nice Aroostook baked potato, maybe a stuffed baked potato with cheese on top, and great green salad, and then blueberry crisp with Gifford's ice cream on top. Can't beat that.
That's hard to. That's pretty much almost a perfect meal right there. Are there any philanthropic or charity organizations that you're passionate about?
There are. In my time in the Senate, I've had 2 causes as far as diseases are concerned. And one is juvenile diabetes, and the other is Alzheimer's disease. I work very closely with JDRF, that's the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and the Alzheimer's Association here in Maine and nationally, and other Alzheimer's groups. I also always donate every year to Catholic Charities, which I think does a great job.
What is your most embarrassing moment? You didn't think you'd get a lot of these questions,
There'd be
did you?
too many of those for me to tell you. It's probably mistaking the identity of someone that I've known for a long time. There were two senators who came in who looked a fair amount alike, and I had the hardest time distinguishing them. Another time I remember was when I was presiding as a brand new senator, and a senator, you're supposed to say, the senator from North Dakota is recognized. You identify their state. Yep. You don't say their name. And I had no idea what state this senator was from. So I said, just the senator is recognized. But I'm sure there have been many others as well, but those pop into my
I'm sure they've
head.
forgiven you for that. Who do you admire?
I admire my parents a great deal because they, to me, in addition to being wonderful parents, are great citizens of our state. They were always very, very civic-minded. They were very civil in their discourse, which is a contrast to the atmosphere we have today.
Yes.
They certainly are among my heroes. George and Barbara Bush, I would also put in that category. I thought the world of both of them, and losing both of them was a blow as well.
In such a short time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I feel really fortunate that I got to see President Bush last September, just a couple of months before he died, at their beloved home in Kennebunkport. So they are certainly heroes. Back further in history, Margaret Chase Smith was certainly a hero of mine. I met her when I was a senior in high school.
Tell me about that.
I was so excited. I was one of two students selected from the state of Maine by the William Randolph Hearst Foundation to go to Washington for a week for what was called, and still exists, the Senate Youth Program. There are two current senators, Cory Gardner of Colorado and I, who went through that program. And I went into her office, and I expected to see her for like 5 minutes and have a quick picture. And instead, she took me into her inner office, and she talked with me for nearly 2 hours, which I cannot believe. Wow. She talked to me about her Declaration of Conscience against...
Fantastic speech.
It was. Joseph McCarthy. She talked to me about her work on Armed Services Committee. She never once talked about what it was like to be the only woman in the Senate, because she considered herself a woman and a senator, but not a woman hyphenated senator.
She didn't have to make that distinction.
Exactly. And I worry sometimes today that we make too many distinctions like that we're all senators and we should respect each other.
Exactly.
And we want diversity, but do we really need to divide ourselves up that way?
Right.
And she certainly did not. In fact, I always loved that she was asked once, where is a woman's place? And she said, everywhere. And that's a great answer.
It really is.
I remember leaving her office, however, and thinking that women could do everything and anything. And keep in mind, this was in 1971. In that era, we weren't quite sure. Mm-hmm. I never, of course, guessed that I would hold her seat in the Senate someday. But I was on cloud nine when I left her office. It was also an exciting trip for me because I'd never been on an airplane, so I'd never flown before. I'd never met a United States senator, and I'd never been to Washington.
Wow, that's a lot of firsts.
It really was.
Quick side note, we were recently, within the last year and a half, went to Alabama. We went to Martin Luther King's church.
Oh, wow.
And while we were there, we met a whole bunch of people, and one woman came around and she introduced herself, and then she said, I've been here since Dr. King was preaching. She knew Dr. King. And my one regret is not saying, what are you doing for lunch? I'd love to go talk to you. So I think that's a fantastic experience.
I went on a faith and politics trip to Selma, Alabama.
You did? Oh, wow.
And saw the church that was blown up and killed the little girls.
I'm getting goosebumps.
And we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and John Lewis went with us. And George Wallace's daughter was there, and I thought how far the world had
yes.
come. And George W. Bush was there with Laura, and Barack Obama with Michelle. It was such an education for someone who grew up in northern Maine.
Exactly.
And was not really attuned to what was going on, to the civil rights movement, I mean.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to transition more into kind of philosophical type of things. What are the most important lessons that you've learned in life? Not just from your parents, because we've talked about that, but from the other people that you've met. You've obviously talked about Senator Smith and what you learned there, but what are the other important lessons you've learned from people?
One of the most important lessons that I've learned from my experience is to be persistent and to not give up, to just keep going, and to believe in yourself and follow your dream. And I tell school children this all the time. When they ask me, how did you get from Caribou, Maine to the United States Senate? And the answer is that I had a lot of support from family and friends, but it doesn't matter whether you're from a small rural town or a big city. You can be whatever you want to be. I am known in the Senate for my persistence, and I'm also known for my preparation. The fact is that working hard does count, and being prepared counts, no matter what field that you're in. You obviously prepared hard for this podcast. It really has enabled me to be more effective as a senator, that I don't give up on my priorities and I do persist in my beliefs. And that doesn't mean that you're closed-minded. And so my second lesson would be to keep learning and keep growing. There's so much out there to learn, and there's so many people to learn from. One of the joys of my job is that I learn something every day. I learn from my constituents. I learn from experts that testify before me or who meet with me. I love learning.
What are you proudest of in your life?
I'm proudest of the fact that I have withstood enormous pressure and at times even abuse to do the right thing. I believe there's no one who's going to agree with my votes all the time. George Mitchell, I think it was, once said that the only person who's going to agree with you all the time is the person you see in the mirror.
Yeah.
And even that isn't necessarily the case. But I'm proud of my integrity.
What lessons have you learned from your relationships that you've formed? You must have formed some close ones. And what are the lessons you've learned from those?
That's a great question. I've learned that you should be very careful not to burn bridges. That your opponent one day may be your ally on an issue the next. That's difficult in the United States Senate when disputes used to be more based on policy, and they've become more personal in recent years, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Yes.
I remember as a young new senator debating Ted Kennedy on the Senate floor on an issue. I was worried about it because here he was, one of the lions of the Senate, a giant of the Senate, much more experienced than I. I was a freshman senator in my first couple of years there, and here I am debating Ted Kennedy. So we went through the debate, and afterwards he very kindly came up and clapped me on the back and said, I really didn't know what I was talking about, and you did a great job. And that was so kind, because I'm sure he sensed that I was nervous about debating him. That's the way the Senate used to be, that people were friends, even if they had policy disputes. Now it tends to be much more divided. I always reach out to people on the other side of the aisle. I think virtually every bill I've introduced is bipartisan. That is frowned upon by the extremes on both sides and by outside ideologically driven groups. To me, that has exacerbated the incivility in our, and polarization in our country, which disturbs me greatly.
Yeah.
A person can disagree with you philosophically and still be a very good person. They're not your enemy. They're not evil. They are a person with a different view. Now, I will say that there are times when my beliefs in that have been sorely tested.
Sure.
But that's a lesson that I've learned about working with people. And indeed, what I've said has been true. I've had disputes with people and then had them join me on the next issue that comes along. So don't burn bridges.
If this was to be our very last conversation, what words of wisdom would you want to pass on?
I would want to tell people that public service is still a worthy calling, that we each have an obligation to try to make the world we live in a better place. Despite the cynicism, the divisiveness, and the hyper-partisanship of the time that we're living in, that there is no excuse for a lack of civility in one's discourse. Social media has allowed people using the cloak of anonymity to say things they would never say to a person face to face.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to go back to a kinder, gentler era where we can disagree without engaging in vicious attacks against one another. But I worry that the political environment that we're in right now will turn off a lot of young people from getting involved. And indeed, I talked to my 22-year-old nephew recently, and he said, you know, Aunt Susan, I always thought that I would want to get involved in public service. And he said, you know, now I'm really not sure that I do. And that worries me. So I hope people won't give up, that they realize they can make a difference at the local level, the state level, national level. There's lots of ways that you can improve your community. And you can start by listening to people who have views that are different than yours.
I have a friend, we're fond of saying, you know, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So.
That is a great line.
I have a couple last questions.
Sure.
These are rapid fire, and then we're all done. So, what is your favorite word?
That's a great question. It's a word that has become out of fashion these days, but it's probably compromise. I don't think that compromise is a sign of weakness. I don't consider it caving in. I consider it a strength and a search for common ground.
What is your least favorite word?
Hatred.
What sound do you love?
Music in general.
What sound do you hate?
People screaming at one another.
What is your favorite curse word? We can bleep it out if you just,
I don't.
unless you don't.
I don't use one.
Okay. Chandler Woodcock gave the same answer. What profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I think had I not been fortunate enough to represent the state of Maine in elective office, I probably would have gone into education. There's nothing I love more than visiting schools, particularly elementary schools.
Yeah.
I originally, when I went to Washington to work for Bill Cohen, I was going to stay 1 year and then go to graduate school. I never got to graduate school, and I could see myself teaching at a small liberal arts college, or I was interested in being a school librarian at one point. Probably I would have gone into education.
Okay. What profession would you not like to do?
I would not like to be an airline pilot.
Okay, fair enough.
I have no sense of spatial relations, so you wouldn't want me to be an airline pilot. And until I ended up flying every week back and forth to
Right.
Maine, I used to have a tendency to air sickness when there was turbulence. So airline pilot
good.
certainly would be number one.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you show up?
I'd like to hear him say, Well done, good and faithful servant.
Nice. Senator, thank you so much. This has been a real treat for me, and I very much appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome home to Maine.
This podcast was created and edited by Scott Malevsky. Thanks to our guest this week, and a special thanks to Ellis Paul for the use of his song, Welcome Home to Maine. You can find his CDs, music, and touring schedule at ellispaul.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and iTunes. For more content and bios, visit www.interviewswithme.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you join us next time.